Hi! This summer I had a bit of a non-vacation on Thrace, where I attended the Isle of Wonders festival. While there, my wallet has been brutally assaulted, but I got a pretty decent haul out of it. However, it could be better. A proper dragon is large, it has scales, 4 legs, 2 wings, and most crucially, it's one giant fire hazard. But this one isn't, so let's fix that. This project also has a deadline. I'm a part of a fantasy club which hosts thematic events once every 3 months. The next one has a Middle-earth thematic and it will take place at the end of September. Part of these events is a mini painting contest with rather unexpected but generous size limits and a deadline you can never forget. Unless you do nepotism, of course, in which case the date is slightly more forgettable. Given a team rushing in with a dragon mini, though with a wingspan this large, can it even be called a mini? This point is incredibly apt. While the model isn't really too friendly and true to how our Lord and Savior, Jolkien R.R. Tolkien envisioned it, it's at least a proper dragon, which Smaug from the hypothetical Hobbit movies that don't actually exist most certainly isn't, at least not by Tolkien standard. Anyway, let's not get derailed too much. Dragons generally breathe fire, but since I cannot get away with setting fire to the entire diorama, I'll have to settle for smoke and optionally some light effects. Retrofitting a smoke machine into the dragon should be technically feasible, as this is a 3D printed model, and it was printed with resin. Large resin prints are typically hollow, because bad things can happen if they aren't, and you don't need to look too closely to notice that our dragon is indeed hollow. The walls aren't particularly thick either, somewhere around 1 mm, which means that there should be ample space inside the dragon's neck and body. Now, with first potential issue out of the way, how do we get some legal smoke for cheap? The answer: you get a mini smoke machine. So, how do you get a smoke machine into the dragon? We probably could, but we also probably shouldn't, especially if we want to be able to refill it. Maintenance and refilling will be a lot easier if we stick the smoke machine into the base that was built with that specific purpose in mind. But there's another potential problem to consider: temperature. Resin generally has a rather poor temperature resistance and starts getting soft at 50 to 60 degrees. Now, you can get resin with better temperature resistance, but if you don't know which resin your model was printed with, you should generally assume the worst. Parts of the smoke machine that are responsible for making smoke can be as hot as 100 to 200 degrees. This shouldn't be a problem for me though, because I'm doing some work to mitigate this. First of all, I will be running the tube from the smoke machine to the mouth. If I don't, I could risk the smoke filling up the inside of the dragon instead of coming out of the mouth. I'll also be using silicone tubes instead of vinyl, because silicone can withstand higher temperatures. Secondly, I intend my puffs of smoke to be short and infrequent. That means that the smoke isn't likely to have enough time to warm the resin beyond the 50 to 60 degree please don't limit. Now it's time to find a route for the tube. With my specific model, I'm in luck because this one is almost free. Front legs offer us a route that's almost completely straight, only requiring us to drill a large hole on one of the feet. Now that we have a concept of a plan, we can start sourcing components for the fire hazard. For generating smoke, there are roughly 2 options. Option 1 is to get a small, portable smoke machine from Amazon. They aren't that expensive, but they still start at around 50 euros. Option 2 is to acquire spent disposable vapes, which can often be acquired for free by just asking around. However, if you plan on doing something like this project yourself, you should really avoid messing with disposable vapes, because disassembling disposable vapes is rather unsafe. First, you'll be getting real close with lithium-ion batteries. Second, spent disposable vapes are never actually completely spent. They still contain concentrated nicotine. Not only is nicotine poison, it will also happily absorb through your skin, and it will also stink up your entire room. If you absolutely have to, do it outside and wear gloves, and don't show off your project anywhere in public. But really, just buy a proper pocket smoke machine and save yourself an immense amount of hassle. With that out of the way, let's move on and start with the base. Because the dragon will eventually have to fit inside my display case, I didn't want to go with circle, but I also didn't want a regular boring square. I started with an octagon with 25 cm between the opposite lines. Since I wanted my base to be printed in one piece, The size limit was 30 cm. That's what my printer can handle. Both of those numbers are smaller than the Dragon's wingspan. However, the size of the base works with similar principles than photography. You can either have wings overhang by a lot, or you can have a reasonable padding between the edges of the base and the tips of the wings. If wings only overhang by a tiny little bit, then it will look kinda bad. So 25 cm it is. But I also wanted the base to have a Dworan ruin feel to it. Dworan ruins imply massive rectangular pillars, some of which can be collapsed. The problem with the pillars is that our octagon doesn't allow us to have a satisfying or even decent spacing between the pillars. Doubly so if we want the pillars to also have a satisfying thickness. So we'll say goodbye to the octagon and say hello to whatever the shape is. I'm not gonna spend too much time on the design. First, I did a not octagon in plasticity. The main base is about 2.5 cm tall and comes in two parts, main base and the lid. Bottom cover has threaded inserts for two 50mm fans. Because our smoke machine is a little bit too fat to fit in 2-ish centimeters of free space that we have in the base, we'll hide the tank and atomization chamber inside one of the pillars. That means that we also need ducts from fans to one of the towers. The bottom cover got printed and the duct covers got welded onto the rest of the base cover. Fans take M4 screws, which means that threaded inserts need to be inserted, and fans get screwed on. The wrong way around the first time, of course. Good thing I did testing early on. The main part of the base also contains our hole for power, status LEDs, and a manual trigger, as well as a few standoffs for any resistors, PCBs, and microcontrollers we would use. The rear side of the octagon also contains a very beautifully designed vent grill, which my printer absolutely refused to print. The pillars are pretty straightforward. Glorified extruded squares. One is hollow, one is toppled, one is missing because it would occupy the same space as the dragon's tail. The three that do exist get a beautiful Dworan vibe pattern on each face. The pattern is chamfered for aesthetic reasons, but I could save myself some work if I added the chamfer to the pattern before I stamped it into the pillars. When I helped my dad as a kid with some chores and forgot to bring him something that he asked for, he had me go fetch that item again with an iconic line. If you don't have it in your head, you will have it in your legs. Kind of applies here, just need to replace legs with carpal tunnel. Lastly, the base needs some accommodations for the smoke tube and possibly wires. For that, and also for the correct position of the toppled pillar, we kinda need to know where the dragon will be placed relative to the base. So let's commit some fair use by scanning the relevant pieces of the dragon. If the 3D scanner decides to cooperate, that's going to be fast. Did my 3D scanner cooperate? Okay, to be fair, it mostly did. With the scans, and with the help of the Plasticity Blender bridge, lining up the holes and the toppled pillar didn't take much effort. Time to head over to the 3D printer and hope I don't get hit with a National 3D Printer Maintenance Day 2 weeks ahead of the submission deadline, because those are some lengthy prints. And hope that said National 3D Printer Maintenance Day doesn't get extended to the second day because my clumsy ass managed to drop the Allen wrench used to assemble and disassemble the hot end for cleaning behind the nearby closet. While the pillars were printing, I finished the designs of the coin piles. Those were also relatively straightforward to create. Step 1. Sculpt a wake blob. Step 2. Put some water into the pot. Step 3. Introduce spaghetti. Though to be fair, it's not as bad as I make it out to be. These parts are optional, and these are super optional. In the meantime, pillars finished printing. This means that we get to take out our good old friend and melt away the layer lines. Actually, we are melting a lot more than just the layer lines, but the more I ruin the print with my soldering iron, the more weathered the pillars look. It's also time for a special dental operation on the dragon. Dentists might say that there is nothing dental about drilling holes into the throat and nose, which is fair, but to also be fair, I am not a dentist. I also decided to remove the bottom part of the neck. It took a while, and it revealed that the dragon isn't as hollow as I initially thought. there's this infill pattern in the way of our tube routes, and that's true for the body as well. Nothing that a drill can't solve, of course. Though I'm sure some people will be mildly triggered over the sideways drilling. Oh dang, I forgot to charge the battery. I guess we'll have to finish it by hand. And there it is. I also did a quick preview of how the neck will light up in case I decide to put some LEDs inside, and the result is not quite what I wanted, but on the other hand, the effect of light shining through the cracks and paint isn't that bad. I will call it a maybe for now and check back on it once I'm done with the final coats of paint. Anyway, final parts of the base finished printing. Let's see how they fit together. Fans fit. Towers fit. Right pile of wood fits. Left pile of gold. Please don't matter. But let's see if we can avoid a reprint. Time to mark the conflict spot. Time to turn on the soldering iron. Time to deform the pile. With this issue out of the way, we can start painting the base. Turns out that the gold isn't covering the coin pile the way I want, so I decided to drown it in orange first, and then paint it over with gold. It's not proper dry brushing, but coin pile texture is annoying enough, it kinda works the same way. At first I intended to paint the pillar detail in gold, but this didn't give me the contrast that I wanted, so I experimented with metallic blue instead, which gave a bit better contrast, until I moved to the unlit side of the pillars and got the same issues on the opposite end. I guess gold it is, except that we'll try to brighten it a bit. Hopefully it works, because I don't think I want to dim the pillars. While the paint is drying, I have one last piece to print, the holder for our smoke tank. Unfortunately, the 3D printer started to outright not cooperate. When removing the first 3D print of the print bed, part of the print bed decided to stay with the print. Worse yet, the 3D printed part didn't even fit into the hole, which means I got 2 L's for the price of 1. The second attempt was also a disappointment, because I forgot Prusa Slicer doesn't do interlocking, so the PLA bits broke off. For attempt number 3, layer retraction issues resulted in spaghetti and a mostly failed print. The fourth print finally printed successfully. Fog liquid tank fit into its place, and the tank holder fit into the tower perfectly. Now it's time to finish the routing for the tube. I wanted to go with the right leg, but drilling a large hole for the tube would be awkward, so I had to settle for the left and all its drawbacks. However, while drilling through the foot, I wasn't quite careful enough, and that caused a part of the foot to break off and fly somewhere ou tripis de materne, as we say. I didn't have the camera rolling, so here's a professional reenactment of the incident. But at least the tube fits the entire way through, so I'll count this as a partial success. You may have also noticed that the left wing appears to be missing a bit as well. What's up with that? Turns out that the bit of the wing is also broken off, and initially I thought that it could look like a tear or a wound, but after priming and the initial coat, it turns out that no, it's very obvious. So first I tried to bridge the gap with some green stuff. However, that wasn't panning out the way I wanted, so instead I used green stuff elsewhere and went for the old reliable just do it in Blender. So far, the 3D scanner is proving to be quite useful for this project. Getting a relatively accurate starting point in 10 minutes is quite handy. Extending the wing in Blender and making it look not overly fake also wasn't too much of a problem, as the missing part was small enough for me to get away with wipe sculpting. My first print was printed with a little bit too much tolerance though, so let's make it a little bit longer. much better. I have deliberately designed the missing bit to be a bit thinner than the wing. If you are gluing two pieces like that together, there is going to be a noticeable edge between them, and in my opinion, filling the gaps requires less time and effort than filing things off, especially when you don't want to file off legitimate detail along with the edge. By the way, you might have noticed that this is taking a bit long. How's the deadline? I decided to ask my calendar, and for some reason it spoke German to me. I think this means I will have to play the nepotism card and ask for a 1-week extension, but let's try to finish the paint job by the deadline. I'm not going to spend too much time on showing how I painted the dragon, especially since, given the time constraints, I'm pretty much aiming for the participation award. TLDR goes a bit like this. Haha, speed paints go brr. Obviously, I decided to paint the dragon before I glued it into the base, otherwise the underbelly would be rather inaccessible, but other than that it was smooth sailing. With that out of the way, time to run the tube for real. The problem with silicone tubes is that you can't bend them too tight, otherwise they will fold. Fortunately, that can be fixed. Copper tube can be bent into tighter radius and then cut off. Ideally, not like this for obvious reasons. While you might be able to keep the tube reasonably round and avoid pinching the tube too much, not using proper tools will make the tube narrower at the place of the cut. Nothing that can't be fixed. Ideally, not like this for obvious reasons. Workplace safety inspectors, please look away 10 seconds ago. Anyway, the tube eventually exists, all the way from the mouth of the dragon to the base. I also tested some LEDs in the neck. Turns out that the paint blocks too much light for my liking, so out they go. At this point, it's time to glue everything together. First, we'll block the neck of the dragon around the tube with some green stuff, and then reinforce everything with super glue and baking soda. After the tube is firmly fixed inside the neck, we'll follow things up by gluing together the rest of the dragon. Because the gaps are ugly, they need to be filled. Our good friends White Stuff and Tweezers make yet another appearance here. Let's call them cable ties for a bit, in order to correct historical wrongs committed by the Verge. At this point, it would also be a good idea to test if our homemade smoke machine actually works. I got some fog machine liquid, which should theoretically be very similar to e-liquid, at least if I haven't made any oopsies during my research. So I poured the fog machine juice into the tank in the clumsiest manner possible and decided to test things without hitting the record button. The results? Okay, so I've tested this and turns out that the vape isn't enough to produce smoke from smoke machines. Rest in pepperoni, my project. Fortunately, there is still time left for me to order a pocket-sized fog machine, which actually managed to arrive ahead of expected arrival date. And boy, I think I just got my new favorite, not a toy. That's definitely going to come in handy when taking photos of my minis in the future. Now, let's test the fog machine on the actual dragon. Initially, the test appears to be mildly promising. However, once the fog machine is connected to the tube, the results aren't quite what I'm looking for. That's a little bit too much smoke for my taste. So, I guess I'll have to find a way to reduce the amount of smoke coming out of the dragon's mouth. Fortunately, I think I have an idea. Step 1. Pump smoke from fog machine into the pillar I initially intended to house my Ghetto homemade smoke machine. Step 2. Use existing fans to slowly push the smoke through the dragon's mouth. Sounds like a good plan. Before moving forward to the electricity part of the project, I quickly cake the base with some fake sand. While the sand is drying and solidifying, let's start to prepare our circuitry. Everything will run off 5 volts, which is the kind of thing you get from your standard USB charger. Turns out you can get basic Type-C connectors for cheap, so let's solder some wires to it. Once that's done, we'll insert the Type-C connector into the hole we designed for it. However, my strategy of trying to melt USB Type-C connector into place isn't working as I planned, so I guess we'll have to do the superglue thing. We'll also solder some of pin headers to this tiny microcontroller I have laying around, because what if I want to reuse it for a different project later down the line? Before soldering anything else, it's time to do some prototyping. We can sorta turn the fans on and off with a single transistor. However, the problem with transistors is that they incur a voltage drop, and they can also hit a limit where they just won't let any more current through, no matter how hard you drive them. This is a problem when both our power supply as well as the fans are made to run on 5 volts. We can see the problem manifest itself when the fan has trouble starting. However, current saturation issues can sometimes be helped a bit by adding a second transistor in parallel. It can also be helped by finding an appropriate transistor for your needs, instead of using the first thing you find laying in your drawer. But hey, if it works, it works. But now that we have a somewhat working prototype, it's time to solder everything together. However, I didn't exactly film the entire process because my soldering skills kinda leave some things to be desired. That, and I forgot that my lens was on manual focus, so everything blurred to high heaven anyway. But eventually, I managed to finish the job and the fans work. Smoke machine also does the smoke bit, however, at the moment, smoke is leaking everywhere. Hopefully because I still haven't screwed the lid to the base. As you may remember, the smoke chamber is in the base, but the air ducts are on the lid. By the way, this is all happening on the Wednesday evening, on the day before the NIPO deadline, and the Dragon isn't quite finished yet. So I pulled the emergency PTO lever at work, so I can work on the Dragon before the club opens on Thursday at 5. Paint job is mostly done, though I do add some finishing touches before doing the unthinkable, going outside and touching the grass, while also applying some matte varnish. While the varnish is drying, it's time to figure out how to trigger our smoke machine. The easiest and least risky option is probably to open and hack the remote, so let's do that. There is nothing special about this remote. We can trigger it by putting some metal across the button contacts. Since I want to trigger it from external output, I need to expose the contacts to the outside. This salvaged barrel jack is just the right thing, and initially it appears to be the right size as well. However, the dreams of barrel jack plug that is flush with the remote are quickly destroyed. Turns out that you can't do that because the PCB is in the way, and you can't cut a hole into the PCB because the outermost trace going all around it is probably the antenna, which means that the barrel plug will have to go outside. Anyway, I scrape the solder mask off the appropriate traces and solder wires onto the spots. I do a pretty shit job filming this, because it turns out it's rather hard to find a feasible camera spot which won't get blocked by my hands while working. I also do a pretty shitty job with the soldering iron, so the barrel jack is glued to the outside of the remote using copious amount of super glue and baking soda. After the glue solidifies, I check whether my barrel plug trigger works. But at this point, time is getting closer and closer to 5, so I pack everything that I have and give Oscar a mic. Of course, TPU gasket isn't gasketing even after the lid is tightly screwed onto the base, but the smoke is rolling out of the mouth exactly as I wanted it to, so I let it slide for the jury demo. Besides, it's not like I could do anything about it at this point. Anyway, after the judging, I do end up taking Dragon home with me in order to finish smoke automation for the public event. Through Friday evening and Saturday, I also end up reprinting all the TPU fittings into a tighter fit and making sure that the silicon bits are clamped to the copper as tightly as possible. I also decided to take a few unpainted goblins, cut and drill them until there's only armor left, paint the armor and put them on the base. Initially, I didn't intend to do that, as Dragon was supposed to be screwed onto the base for easier maintenance later down the line. However, Afterwards they revealed that the base is a bit too flexible, so the screws weren't holding the dragon as tightly as I liked. Operation Superglue happened, and since there were no longer any reasons for avoiding decorations around the foot of the dragon, that decision was rectified. I also soldered together a trigger circuit for the camera, but I lost the footage for that. Turns out that the camera apparently overheated, stopped recording, and because I was in a hurry, I kinda didn't catch that until it was way too late. Smoke chamber in the Dragon base also received additional TPU gasket, which I hoped would seal the smoke chamber a bit better. It didn't fix the issue, but, much like tightening around the tubes, it did help a lot, to the point the smoke was now also leaking through the intake fans. Anyway, with that everything was done. I wipe coded a basic loop off screen and flashed the program to the microcontroller. Then I put the lid on the base, and once all the screws were tight, I decided to test whether everything works correctly, so let's go through the loop once. The sequence starts by powering the fans. Normally, there wouldn't be any smoke in the base at this point, but I decided to pre-smoke for the test. After 10 seconds, the smoke machine turns on and produces smoke for 10 seconds. Then it turns off, and the fans continue to slowly push the remaining smoke out for the next 2 minutes. Although the smoke usually dissipates in under half a minute. After 2 minutes, the cycle repeats. With that, the project is done, and it's time for me to go because I'm kinda late for an event. In the meantime, enjoy some shots of the finished project. Also, turns out that the judging criteria for the contest I mentioned earlier are constantly changing, and I actually managed to get the Most Creative Mini award. While in the grand scheme of things, it's not really much, given that the contest was our club thing with 10 entries total and not a properish con. Well, I will take it. By the way, what do werewolves do after seeing a YouTube video that they really like? They like and subscribe.